Rupert, can I just start as I generally do by asking you for your latest thoughts on the state of the war?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, it feels as though we're in a bit of a pause, but of course that belies what's really happening on the ground. So I think it's one of the things that we must be cautious of in the United Kingdom and elsewhere is when when there don't appear to be big events going on to be thinking that therefore nothing's happening, because of course even when there's no big movements on the battlefield, that doesn't suggest that the Russians and Ukrainians aren't fighting day to day, and the same applies on what you might call the home front. So we've become a bit immune to the Russian attacks onto Ukrainian critical infrastructure that have been running for kind of 2 months now, and there was another big wave of attacks on Wednesday. A great many of those drone attacks by the Russians actually shot down.
Yes.
Indeed, President Zelensky said all 13 of the drones that were launched were successfully shot down.
On the wider strategic situation around Ukraine and this war, it was so interesting, wasn't it, Rupert, to see Denmark announce that it's scrapping a public holiday to increase productivity in the economy. They say to with the purpose, with the aim of increasing defence spending, with the threat from Russia in mind. That was a significant moment, I think.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think defence feels a much more real issue to most nations in Europe than it probably has done for a very long time. And we always talk about our defence spending as a proportion of GDP. The NATO base figure being about being 2%, and of course, if your GDP goes down, your the economy is struggling, then ultimately you get to spend less money on defense as well.
Yeah, of course, it's obviously important and worth saying that Denmark and Finland are frontline countries when it comes to confronting Russia. And after so many years of being outside NATO, well armed and defended, yes, but outside NATO, joining NATO, as those countries, both of them, wish to do, it is a big example of how Putin's whole plan, his game plan, has backfired.
Finland and Sweden, yes, certainly. They have been outside of NATO over the years, but they have been in close partnership with NATO. And indeed, as part of my last role, I was responsible for what was called the Joint Expeditionary Force, and it was a group of 10 Northern European nations. We called ourselves the like-minded nations, and Finland and Sweden were both members of that,
Yeah.
despite not being NATO nations. So they've always been closely or recently been closely aligned to NATO. But as you say, President Putin's actions in Ukraine it would have been inconceivable 2 years ago to think that Finland and Sweden would be joining NATO.
And they are well, and they will be received with open arms. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, we've seen senior Ukrainian officials, according to the latest reports, warning of a possible broad New Year Russian offensive once the winter period passes. What are your thoughts on that? Does that seem likely to you?
Well, it's certainly. I mean, I think there's potentially a number of things going on. So um, it is possible that the Ukrainians are playing with information, disinformation. That's a very effective thing to do. They've done it very effectively through the course of the war, and so they could be playing mind games, or they could genuinely have some intelligence to suggest that the Russians are gearing up for a New Year offensive.
Yes.
We've talked about previously, and I think there's growing recognition that in this part of the world you don't get a kind of winter pause in fighting. You perhaps do in the autumn and the spring when it's very muddy, but as soon as the ground freezes, it's very tough for soldiers, but actually it creates good ground conditions for maneuver operations. So
Yes.
it is entirely possible the Russians would aspire to an offensive in the new year. The bigger question is whether or not they've got the ability to follow through on it. Have they got the capability? Have they got the numbers? Have they got the command and control, the logistics, the wherewithal to really mount a credible offensive? It doesn't feel like it based on the evidence of the last 6+ months. It really actually since the start of their invasion.
Yeah, well, the game plan after the invasion in February, it ended up in tiny fragments, didn't it? And since then, well, so much has gone wrong for Russia. You'd imagine that such a thing as a second push on Kyiv surely out of the question.
I mean, it feels like out of the question. And what feels more likely is they might try and achieve some kind of localized offensive. Even a localized offensive. They've shown nothing in their, if you like, their conceptual arsenal since they fell back from Kyiv and they repostured to the east. All of the plays have come from the Ukrainians. And apart from using missiles, a lot of firepower against the Ukrainians, the Russians have just not demonstrated what we would in the military call the operational art, the ability to really orchestrate a big successful operation.
As you look at the Ukrainian effort, are you satisfied from Ukraine's point of view that they are getting the kind of support and munition supplies that they need? We're heading into a really crucial winter. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, was saying, I think just in the last 24 hours, these next 6 weeks are going to be crucial. Do you believe that Ukraine are getting what they need to hang on to the advances and the advantages that they've gained and push a bit further?
Well, President Zelensky and the Ukrainians have very wisely and understandably all the way through called for more. You would, wouldn't you? Do they need more? Would they benefit from more? Undoubtedly. But what I think NATO nations and others have sought to do throughout this conflict is just moderate the support, ramp it up without crossing any kind of invisible trigger line for the Russians, and inadvertently be the escalator to the war growing geographically or in terms of its intensity. So, I mean, there's talk of the United States potentially providing Patriot missiles. That would be a big step up in capability for the Ukrainians. So I think this will be an ongoing discussion between defense ministries to keep providing President Zelensky what he needs, and he's just about got what he needs. But if you give too much, he can't absorb it quickly enough and turn it into true capability anyway.
Yes, yes. While we got you with us, can I just ask your opinion on what we heard last night from the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Satoni Radican, and he was turning his focus to China and rather longer term. Now he was discussing the melting of polar ice caps, opening up new sea routes, in particular sea routes which could then be used by the Chinese Navy as changing significantly the whole strategic picture. Can I just ask you for your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we have been monitoring globally that sea route opening up for a number of years, and it is becoming more and more of a realistic proposition, both from a trade and a military perspective. There are a number of factors up there. The Russians have been militarizing that area as the caps have melted. So I think Admiral Radican is right to highlight that to people. We know that the Chinese military have grown enormously in size and capability in recent years. Of course, not in any way combat tested, but in capability that has grown. We know that their navy have spread their wings further and further towards the Indian Ocean and elsewhere. And so it shouldn't come as a great surprise that they will seek to potentially begin to have an influence into the Atlantic. But in a way, there was nothing new in what Admiral Radican said yesterday in terms of the threats he set out. They're well understood in relation to Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. He name checked all of those to varying degrees.